Cobra's got the right materials. Cobra's got the perfect place. Cobra launch base. Cobra launch base. Cobra's got a threat more evil than G.I. Joe has ever faced. Cobra launch base.
Dr. Mindbender!
We're ready for the Joes. Launch the Firebat.
G.I. Joe!
Won't know what hit them.
G.I. Joe, American hero.
Will the Cobra launch base be the beginning of the end for G.I. Joe? Find out in Marvel Comics.
Searching my past for the things that I've seen. Is it my life or just something I dream?
Résumé. Noun. 1. A summing up, summary. 2. A brief written account of personal, educational, and professional qualifications and experience. I accidentally missed the Marvel Saga, the official history of the Marvel Universe number 12 on the first week of August. It had Hulk and Submariner teaming up to battle the Fantastic Four. There was so much more Fantastic Four and Namor in the early Marvel comic stories than the MCU ones. The capsules are really flying by this point, so I'm not going to touch on them episode by episode. Anyway, the return of Captain America in the early days of the Marvel Age triggers a lengthy recap of his history, blessedly involving peak art by Jack Kirby and John Byrne. We get into the Invaders, Baron Zemo, and Cap's joining the Avengers. I'll be honest, I'm not certain that my brother bought this issue. The material is very familiar to me from the Fireside Sentinel of Liberty trade paperback and issues of the Stern Byrne Cap run I picked up at flea markets. But he does get the next issue, so maybe it just didn't resonate as much with me because of that familiarity. I'm uncertain when I got my hands on Alpha Flight number 41, but I lean toward either a 3-pack or a pull from the quarter bin. Either way, this 1986 comic gives me 1989 vibes. It's about the daughter of the Purple Man, a fairly obscure villain at the time, suddenly acquiring Daddy's powers and complexion rather late into her teenage years for a mutant. After finding out her hidden backstory, she steals her mother's credit cards and runs away to a ski resort? See, she's had a lifetime crush on a now retired but far famed French-Canadian ski champion, who is now the superhero North Star, and she ends up using her power to control people on him. I didn't understand at the time why he was so put out by having the intense interest of an attractive young woman, but now the subtext is long made text, I get it. If the Purple Man had done that to me, I would have been cool with it either. I've always liked Dave Ross, very well served by the inks of Will Sportazio, and the purchase would make more sense if it occurred after one handed off the reins of the Punisher ongoing series to the other. Despite digging the story, it'd be years later before I got around to the next chapter. My half-brother bought Amazing Spider-Man number 283, which I read for the thin connection to Secret Wars via the appearances of Titania and the Absorbing Man. He also got Animax number 1, based on a toy line so short-lived that I don't think he even had any of the figures. And you guys, he had so many action figures. I ran an eBay search, and they apparently came with a Motu style mini comic, but the full-size Marvel ones are a lot more readily available than the actual figures, and look a lot better besides. You can still snag loose toys for under $20, so I'm guessing they're not so much ultra rare as simply little traded undesirables. Some of the villains look pretty neat, but the heroes are all dorks and giant animal masks that make them look like Razorback. There's a reason why that Mort of the Month was used early and often in John Byrne's humorous sensational She-Hulk run. The comic is actually really neat. A bizarre heavy metal Mad Max riff with animal machine cyborgs, which makes it real unnerving when you see the bad guy spit roasting such a creature, despite being some sort of hybrids themselves. Just imagine Bebop eating Rocksteady. The book features rare, sort of mainstream hero artwork by Sam and Max creator Steve Purcell, given a savage embellishment by the finally beneficial Jerry Telleot. The book already gives big pagan vibes, but then the lead villain goes full bondage freak. Red skin and bat wing satanic panic action. This feels like an ill-fitting foreign import. So how this was spawned in Reagan's America, I'll never know. And Walt Simonson wrote it? What a trip. The book lasted 4 issues, but our interest and/or accessibility didn't. Little Bro bought Doctor Strange number 80, in which all manner of monster attacked the master of the mystic arts friendship circle, and the man himself spiritually, as his physical body was undergoing surgery at a hospital. Another sophisticated tale by Peter B. Gillis, with some of the best art of Chris Warner's career, under Randy Emberlin inks. Definitely had Gru the Wanderer in the house, though I'm not sure who bought it. This was the one where an ambassador with the unfortunate name of Gru, spelled with a U, is constantly mistaken for the dim-witted barbarian and beaten for it. It's a nice enough bit that overstays its welcome, which frankly is how I tend to view Gru as a whole. I remember being put off by that Little League cover to Mark Hazard Merc number 2 when I was eyeballing it at the 7-Eleven. I never had any interest in sports, and hate when they intrude on my nerdy comics world. I needn't have worried, because the story story is also about Mark's son's dumb baseball game violently colliding with the grim realities of a soldier of fortune. Well, realities. That said, it's also a funny book. Before Peter David went completely overboard with the puns and sight gags, Mark Hazard is a thug from a brutal world, so the humor stays firmly in the sardonic and bleak vein. This material needs to be collected in a higher quality presentation, certainly more so than freaking Night Mask, which got a comprehensive trade paperback in 2018 to tie in with Secret Wars, I guess. Gray Morrow's art is shot directly from the pencils, and the line is so light that it nearly disappears on newsprint. A lot of the definition comes from D. Martin's pale coloring, which is also imperiled by the lousy paper, but entirely appropriate to the art. Merck was easily the most grounded, realistic, and in the early issues, handily the overall best New Universe title. But part of its reality is that however sympathetic its lead may be played here, this guy would be a villain in the Marvel Universe. And that had to set a moralist like Jim Shooter's teeth on edge. This was so early in David's career that I have an easier time seeing him getting fired from this book for some of the choices he makes here than having left it of his own volition. And at least as credited, this is Morrow's last issue for a while. Most of the time, I think the creative turnover on these titles is a result of there being low-paying dregs, but here I think the book was simply too daring for the boss man. I love it, and will miss this team going forward. My brother bought the Mutant Massacre tie-in Power Pack number 27 for the Wolverine and Sabretooth appearances. It was overall too domestic and kiddie for our tastes, but then you'd have Scalp Hunter standing atop a pile of bodies as he gunned down adorable mutant children. Man, that's just wrong. I like the John Bogdanove art a lot more now than I did then, but then again, Power Pack still strikes me as a kid's book that their parents would prefer, which tracks. One of the most demanding elements of this podcast in years past has been my coverage of the fall television lineup. I'd go through all the new and returning shows that I watched in that time period, sort of like how in those days the networks would create preview shows of their own upcoming lineup to hook viewers. There'd be so much to cover, the TV stuff threatened to eclipse the comics. At this point, there's so much comics content that I don't think that would be a problem, but I also don't want to break the hour barrier on this show, so nuts to that. New plan. I go through each night of programming across the next 7 months, rather than killing myself trying to do it in one fell swoop, then cast out for stuff to fill out the TV spot for the rest of the year. This episode, Sundays of September. The last couple of weeks before school started were always a big downer for me, because I loved my free time exploring the world and playing. I didn't want or need the rigid structure of school. Because we were always moving around, I had to adapt to a new selection of jerks on unfamiliar ground. This was a comparatively good year. Since we were back in the neighborhood where I grew up, I had plenty of friends, for me anyway, and the vibes were good. But that didn't render the waning hours of my weekend joyous. I'd occasionally catch a bit of 60 Minutes or Our House, but neither was really my scene. I think Our House was about a single mother moving her family in with her father, played by Wilford Brimley, the diabetes guy. Fun fact, many of you listening to this podcast are now around the same age as the 52-year-old actor, who is also playing a retiree in the Cocoon movies around this time. It's a well-worn shock tactic. But let's just be honest now that this man is dead and say plain that he just aged badly. The actress playing his daughter, Deidre Hall, was just 13 years his junior, and as far as I know is still appearing on Days of Our Lives. She looks great at 76. Anyway, Our House only ran a couple of seasons, and its creator James Lee Barrett died of cancer shortly after at just 59 years old. The granddaughter on the show, Shannon Doherty, just died this year at age 53, a year older than Wilford Brimley was when the show started. But again, if I was watching anything on TV in this frame, it was probably the Disney Sunday movie on ABC. Likewise, ABC, CBS, and NBC all had Sunday night movies. And between the three networks, there was usually one flick I wanted to watch. Plugging into a 2-hour movie made it easier to forget that the time until Monday morning was ticking away. Apparently, the 1981 blockbuster Raiders of the Lost Ark debuted on ABC this month, a half-decade release window from silver screen to cathode tube. You kids don't know how good you got it. One show that I did not watch but had to mention is Together We Stand. Exactly the kind of show Adult Swim was lampooning with the Too Many Cooks short. This thing starred Elliot Gould and Dee Wallace Stone as the parents of one biological child and another adopted. The integration had gone so well that a social worker, played by Edie McClure, pressured the mom to adopt not one, but 2 additional children at the same time. And where the other kids were white like their parents, the new kids were a little black girl and Short Round from Indiana Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, entering his awkward teenage years. The show swiftly tanked, was pulled off the air, and returned as the retooled Nothing Is Easy. Between incarnations, they killed off Elliot Gould's character, brought in a bitter divorcee best friend for the widow, and both incarnations had painfully saccharine theme songs. The new version did even worse than the old, and left 6 episodes unaired after its cancellation. Also in September, daytime talk show queen Oprah Winfrey went national, but I wasn't aware of her until after we moved to Nevada in 1987. Siskel and Ebert in the Movies launched in syndication, but it was just the latest iteration of a series of movie critique shows with the hosts that dated back to sneak previews on PBS, which I also watched with Jeffrey Lyons and Michael Medved on board. I loved watching people going deeper into dissecting cinema, and that certainly influenced my own hyper-analytical approach that drives people to drink today. When I was a kid, I tended to favor Roger Ebert because I thought he was the looser and nicer of the two. Gene Siskel could come off as a pretentious bully, especially when he attacked Ebert on his weight. But as I got older, I found that Ebert could be painfully obtuse and would die on the oddest hills, while Siskel was often more insightful. They both had their bad days though, and as the years went by, it became more obvious how narrow their perspective was. Look how often they backtracked on reviews because critics with a different, frankly better perspective on a subject would school them on the blind spots. Regardless, they were hugely beneficial to the discourse, and I miss their learned, authoritative voice among the legions of loud plebes we suffer today.
Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris, man of action. Chuck Norris stars in Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. Chuck Norris, he's got nerves of steel and strength to match. Chuck Norris with his team, Pepper.
It's too dangerous, Chuck. Wow.
Too much.
Too much.
Kimo, the samurai warrior. Reed, Chuck's teenage apprentice. Tabe, a sumo champion. With Chuck Norris, they battle the sinister forces of the Claw.
Remember this.
And the ruthless Super Ninja.
I'll finish Norris.
Chuck Norris stars in Chuck Norris Karate Commandos.
As I mentioned last month, my Batman number 402 came in a 3-pack, so it's wild how much of this thing was centered on my interests, while being bought largely sight unseen. As the middle book numerically, I might not have even known there was a Jim Starlin cover in the mix, much less full interiors. This may have been around the time Epic Comics started playing monkey in the middle with his Dreadstar royalty checks, and I understand that he needed the fill-in gig for quick cash to pay an income tax bill. After having spent much of the 80s on cosmic science fantasy, and also entering a period where he was losing interest in drawing, Starlin's stiffness and extremely dated fashions stood out like a sore thumb. Bruce Wayne hanging out at the Playboy Mansion in his heft smoking jacket with a clearly much younger Robin, and a John Waters looking Alfred should have had Wortham spinning in his grave, and the Swanderson look of it all would have been in Seduction of the Innocent era appropriate. But Starlin also brings a 70s New York urban grit, along with some seriously grindhouse ultraviolence that it could have only gotten by an almost entirely defanged comics code authority. It's about a guy whose mind is broken by tragedy and comes to think that he's the Batman, but with an MO closer to Shadowhawk. Batman had to catch him to clear his own name, and before he kills again. Not gonna lie, I lapped it up. By the way, I didn't realize that all this material had been collected in a trade paperback in 2015, and thought I might pick it up. The not so aptly named Batman Second Chances trade is going for upwards of $150 online. To me, that's stupid high for readily attainable late 80s corporate IP that will inevitably be reprinted again, if only on account of those stupid prices indicating demand. Where I was somewhat indifferent toward my brother's copy of the first issue, I think I started feeling it more with DP7 number 2, where the book was initially told from a single character's perspective about the no-duh, too-good-to-be-true clinic that was grooming the displaced paranormals for service to the CIA. We get the proper ensemble on the run that will drive this title. These characters each have their own voice and perspective. Disagreements are organic, and their coordinating a plan of action is relatable. There's no Professor X here to provide guidance, a mansion, a stealth fighter. These are just a bunch of people from all walks of life, trying to escape a bad situation, barefoot and underdressed in backwoods and off the highway, as they're hunted by other powered beings. We see clever applications of everyone's powers, and Paul Ryan's relatively unglamorous art suits this more domestic take on mutant tropes. There's a reason why this was the New Universe title that lasted the longest, and managed to be one of the best regarded Mark Gruenwald runs overall. I wrote a lot about Flint last month, so that doesn't leave me much to say about G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero number 54. The cover by Mike Zeck had him parachuting while a Cobra airship came gunning for him, and he memorably featured on one of those animated TV commercials where Marvel conspired with Hasbro to sidestep regulations by promoting the comic books and not the toys, even though they chant Cobra Launch Base 50-something times in 30 seconds. Flynn is captured by the twins Xander and Zaymot to be turned over to Dr. Mindbender for conditioning. Can you smell the refresh in here? There's also a lot of Serpentor, while Cobra Commander and Destro are literally buried and presumed dead under the remains of the pit, just to make the subtext text. I wouldn't see the actual flick until home video, but I did buy the first issue of Howard the Duck, the movie, at the local 7-Eleven. Given that they only had 3 issues to adapt a feature film, I'm not sure it was wise to devote so many pages to the moody opening sequence and the Hunger City sequence where the band Cherry Bomb plays Howie through a series of misadventures upon his arrival in the misfit city of Cleveland. What was wise was having Kyle Baker draw it, giving the very 70s Howard a fully 80s makeover. The book just looks cool, even if the story's a mess and Baker is definitely in comic strip mode. I got a commission done at Beverly to get signed by Leah Thompson and was embarrassed when the artist sexed her up. I wish I'd given Baker's Beverly art as the reference instead of pictures, because he better balances the new wave rocker and suburban girl next door qualities of the character as depicted in the movie. Danny Fingeraw's script doesn't launder the weaknesses from the movie as effectively, and in fact he probably highlights the more off-putting aspects of the characters' personalities, which is likely why I didn't come back for the other 2 parts. I do think I'll keep an eye out for the Marvel Movie Super Special magazine that collects this thing though, if I can get it cheap. Let's be real, if I find one, it'll be cheap. Justice number 2 featured more of a young Jeff Isherwood's solid Adams-esque pencils undermined by Vince Colletta inks, as our protagonist kills his cellmates in a New York jail. Then he's interrogated by Rebecca Chambers. I was going to make a Cheers joke, but I myself was mixing up Diane Chambers and Rebecca Howe, where the most famous Rebecca Chambers is the Stars chick from the first Resident Evil that isn't Jill Valentine. This Becky Chambers is the black plainclothes cop that is pursuing the same drug dealers as John Tinson, the guy we mostly just call Justice. He's totally hot for Becky's pure blue aura, to the extent that he kisses her, which even in the 80s was a big no-no while being interrogated for multiple murders. His whole story about being a justice warrior from another dimension gets a big boost when the pair are attacked by brown-skinned weird creatures that run wild on the jail. These creatures lack auras and cannot be affected by Justice's energy sword, so he just has to straight up break the necks. But his left-hand shield square things will stop Becky's bullet, so don't ask me how this is supposed to work as anything but a pure fantasy title, surely undercutting that world outside your window sales pitch. Justice basically just walks out of the pokey, then brutally executes a bunch of drug dealers that get the money to pay for a cab ride to Los Angeles. I don't know what drugs Steve Englehart was on when he wrote this, but you can definitely note his distinctly oddball touch over the next several issues, now that both of the book's creators have abandoned it. Marvel Saga number 13 is back for the second week of September. It's a Daredevil spotlight issue, given verisimilitude by Klaus Janson inks on the Keith Pollard cover. The earlier pages, though, were devoted to Hulk's first major battle with the combined Fantastic Four and Avengers, with that great Donkey Kong image of Hulk throwing girders from atop a skyscraper into construction as heroes make their way up and through it. Black Widow gets introduced to Iron Man, triggering flashbacks to her origins with Gene Colan art and too many repurposed Ohatmu entries. Spider-Man gets Betty Brant's ne'er-do-well brother killed, and the Avengers face the Masters of Evil. It's a good issue, made better by the Daredevil section favoring Frank Miller art, though it made for a fierce juxtaposition with the sunnier Bill Everett panels. After the United States' defeat in the Vietnam War, and the despicable reception our lost and wounded soldiers faced upon returning home, we as a nation needed to have a serious conversation about these matters in the aftermath. But instead we got Reagan and Rambo to whitewash the whole thing. Jim Braddock still returning to liberate POWs and effectively win the war we lost as late as 1989. There were a few years of introspection, and then we were right back to Team America World Police. As a child of the 80s, I was exposed to a near constant barrage of Vietnam War material, and I really wasn't prepared to parse the legitimate consideration from the non-exploitation. I don't recall if it was myself or my brother who bought the first issue of Marvel Comics as the NAM, as we more or less alternated issues, and I'm also not sure where that title fell on the line I've drawn. The book was conceived by editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, who had a mock-up put together that married the title to an image from a G.I. Joe comic, and they ended up hiring popular Joe artist Michael Golden. You have to figure Shooter wanted a Joe-like title that Marvel would own, and would tap into the popular subject at cinemas at the time. On the other hand, he assigned the job of editor to Vietnam vet Larry Hama, also of G.I. Joe, who turned around and hired fellow vet Doug Murray to write it as a real-time exploration of Murray's own experiences in the war. So whatever Shooter's intentions, Hama was playing it straight, and it seemed to make a major splash. The first issue outsold Uncanny X-Men, and it was a newsstand staple for as long as Golden was on the title. The book got glowing newspaper write-ups, was swiftly collected in trade paperback, and was also repackaged as a black and white magazine. I feel like this book had to be tapping into a mainstream audience beyond the comics faithful, but when I look at the circulation statements, they're nothing special. Less than 170,000 by around issue 15. and Golden would have drawn most of them up to that point, which had to be disappointing for someone of his fame. This first issue is stunning to look at, not only for its hyper-detailed art, but also for Golden's sublime coloring. You're immediately endeared to the characters, despite relatively sparse dialogue peppered with so much lingo that a dense glossary was included at the back of each issue to decipher it. That said, we ate it up, and for a brief period it was among our favorite titles. Among the effects of the Mutant Massacre was my actually buying Uncanny X-Men every month with my own money, even number 212 with the Rick Leonardi art. That said, it was a bloody Barry Windsor Smith Wolverine cover at the start of the Logan vs. Sabretooth feud. I guess Storm also fought Callisto again, but when it's over sewers full of meat that used to be Morlocks, who actually cares? By 1986, I'd probably heard several Talking Head songs and maybe even seen some videos. But the first one I have a strong memory of was Wild Wild Life. It tied into the movie True Stories, which I wasn't aware of until one of my customers loaned me a copy in the latter days of my shop. I was bored by that, but the music video took advantage of its cast, featuring John Goodman and a karaoke scene mocking other contemporary artists. It was a fun tune and video, making the strongest impression on me regarding the band to date. You Give Love a Bad Name was the breakthrough hit for Bon Jovi, whose first two albums hadn't amounted to much. By contrast, Slippery When Wet went 15 times platinum, was the top-selling album of 1987, and remains one of the top 20 biggest albums of all time. To put that in perspective, Taylor Swift's biggest record only went 10 times platinum, and would have to rely on Ties to crack the top 100. I was still in my country and oldies bubble, but this was the first hard rock album that I ever embraced. Alright, let's be honest, Bon Jovi was more hard pop, but still it was progress for me. For some reason, I associated the Human League's Human with outdoor PE classes, but I can't imagine exercising to that. This wasn't a band I paid attention to until I started digging into new wave cuts years later. Cameo's Wired Up was another semi-novelty crossover hit that I could expect to hear in public spaces, like the flea market, affecting Larry Blackmon's nasal twang to join him in bellowing the chorus is near irresistible. This one lingered on pop radio for years, it's just too much fun. Orange Juice Jones's The Rain is another one I associate with places like the flea market food court. It's an infidelity classic. And while I think it's fallen out of popular consciousness with time, this was the go-to track for busting a cheater into the 90s. I want to say that it got used ironically in a comedy at some point too. And no, I'm not thinking of the SNL skit with Donald Glover, but it still counts. Peter Cetera had an awesome summer as he chased the Karate Kid themed Glory of Love with a chart-topping duet with Christian pop poster child Amy Grant, The Next Time I Fall. I have to confess though, I wasn't consciously aware of Grant's existence until her saccharine solo single Baby Baby in 1981. And that's still the only song of hers I recall if you put a gun to my head. I'm not a big adult contemporary guy, but I'm also not immune to the choice ivory tinkling of Bruce Hornsby in the Ranges the way it is. Diddly, diddly, diddly. Feel guilty about homelessness? Diddly, diddly, diddly. And racism too? Diddly, diddly, diddly. Like Hornsby, I lumped Steve Woodenwood's Freedom Overspill into a column of old hippies that had preachy bangers in the time frame. I used to think it was about pollution, but reading the lyrics, it seems to be about yuppies. Although it mostly just seems to be about a pale imitation of Peter Gabriel. Boston's Amanda came out this month, but to me, they were 70s old-timers, and I have no recollection of hearing the tune new. I think maybe it was on a TV hits collection, or heard on a mellow music station a bit down the line. Finally, another enormous, decade-defining hit, Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles. Sure, it's a goofy novelty song, but then Susanna Hoffs does that eye roll in the music video, triggering a million little boys to start puberty. You do know how to whistle, don't you? Just put your lips together and blow. Classic X-Men number 4 reminds me of just what a crazy book this was. You had those utterly modern, exhaustively rendered, perfect superhero images on the front cover and front piece by Arthur Adams. Then you'd have these brittle, thin, awkward and fragile lines of John Bolton on the back covers and backup stories. Bolton had that art school quality. It was such a misfit on costume action, but perfect for these introspective character pieces that Chris Claremont was crafting. This one was about Logan and Kurt becoming fast friends during mock combat, and later as part of a dare where Nightcrawler reveals his true form in the town near the X-Mansion. I'd argue it's a lesser tale, but there's that swell story title lettered by Tom Orzechowski, and Bolton manages some surprisingly iconic hero images. Between the two, you have Dave Cockrum producing new pages of story to supplement the old, while Claremont reworks the original dialogue to better fit later characterization and changing publication standards. This came at no small expense, not the least because all that bonus content came at the cost of any advertisements or marketing materials on a newsstand comic. That said, it also came at a better than 25% markup on the usual 75 cents demanded for a typical Marvel comic. Regardless, it was a good return on investment to get a top-selling title out of a reprint from pre-royalty inventory material. I recall seeing the first issue of G.I. Joe Comics magazine, a digest-sized sequential reprint of the monthly comic, but I'm not confident if I ever bought any. As much as I was into the title, I didn't feel a compulsion to read back material, especially with the yearbooks around to summarize it. I also like comic books mainly with an allowance for magazines, but digests and treasuries were always too extreme in dimensions for someone who had to pick up all their worldly goods as often as I did. But also digests were so puny, such a compromised way of reading material that was never intended to be printed so small. My following on to ElfQuest number 17 is somewhat inexplicable. I was still into fantasy trappings in that time, where I've since developed a strong aversion. I'm sure the pretty art, strong female characters, and soap opera were a draw. The abrupt stopping points and overall meandering nature were not. Plus those annoying web fairies were still there. There was a lot of telepathic torture in this issue, as one would find in a typical X-Men comic. I don't think my brother was buying them either, so it was all me. As much as I gripe about Keith Pollard's Marvel Saga covers, he's a great fit taking over the official handbook of the Marvel Universe Deluxe Edition with number 13, Super Adaptoid to Umar. Pollard did a lot of style guide work, and most of the art for the Master Edition. He's no Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, but he knows his way around these characters in the Bronze Age Marvel style. If you don't immediately notice the absence of John Byrne, he's getting the job done, with all due credit to the inks of Joseph Rubinstein. All the usual suspects are inside: Byrne, Zek, Simonson, plus another couple of entirely random Bollins. Paul Smith contributes, and I could have included him with the other surnames, but I thought folks might assume I meant Barry Windsor Smith. Which leads me to wonder, how did we end up with more Bollin pieces in Ohatmu than BWS ones? I feel like I should have learned my lesson by Superpowers number 4, but the comic is too familiar to deny. Maybe my brother bought it, or I dug it out of a quarter bin within a few years of relief. This final issue was about Kupperberg and Infantino playing with the same Wave 3 figures that I would have, if I had them all. They never made a Janus figure, which was just Darkseid masquerading in a more comics-accurate Orion than the Manny Faces version from the toys. But Golden Pharaoh, Mr. Miracle, Tyre, Steppenwolf, and the rest were still on toy shelves for you to play your own games on Apocalypse. Well, maybe not Cyborg, but I do think I have a vague recollection of passing on that now highly sought-after figure for something more gimmicky and disposable, probably Cyclotron and his dumb removable faceplate, which I didn't have long before it got stolen. Like I hope it also happened to this lousy comic. As referenced last month, my half-brother bought the Mighty Thor number 374 as a tie-in to the Mutant Massacre crossover, and I think closer to the time of release. It must have been so disappointing to circle back to 373 for a few pages of lead-in, already covered in the same week's X-Factor comic. Anyhow, Thor takes on Harpoon, Blockbuster, and Vertigo, sending them running in moments. That trio was more than holding their own, at least with a few more members at any given time, against whole X-Men teams. Thor was saving Angel, who was permanently crippled in this encounter, so I guess that helps depict their relative power levels, and if I recall correctly, Thor was at reduced strength in this period. Was it the whole reason he grew the beard because his visage had been rendered ghastly by the touch of death? No, really, I haven't read these comics in nearly 40 years, and I was never big on Thor. That's why when they go back to Balder and the Midgard Serpent, I check right out. I hope I remember right, because one of the Marauders comes back to break Thor's arm, and the only other thing he does in the crossover is wander around and befriend Artie, the big-headed pink kid that projects holograms. Not a big win for the Thunder God here. More Simonson on Simonson action coming at you in X-Factor number 11, another chapter of the notorious Mutant Massacre. This one isn't as well remembered because it's mostly about Morlocks that lived, at least for now, but still a sight better than the early issues.
Next time I fall in love, I'll know better what to do. Next time I fall in love, the next time I fall in love, the next time I fall in love.
As TV comes up, movies go down. It's not that there were bad pictures, just not that many of them, and only one actually seen in a theater. When I talked about Siskel and Ebert before, a movie like Blue Velvet was exactly the kind of thing I'd learn about and value because of my exposure to film criticism, as opposed to whatever was being hyped that week. And it's not that I'm particularly precious about Blue Velvet specifically, as I wouldn't see the surreal murder mystery until years later on video. It's another instance of a revered movie reaching me too late, because I already knew David Lynch and Kyle MacLachlan from the television series Twin Peaks, and was more immersed in that than I ever would be Lynch's films. But I was more receptive to that kind of challenging material by being prepared for it by film critics, and Twin Peaks never gets made without the success of Blue Velvet, so it still matters in the grand scheme of my developing interests. I saw both The Name of the Rose and The Boy Who Could Fly on video, I think, the former sticking in my memory far more than the latter. That'll happen when you have Sean Connery playing a monk detective solving a macabre murder mystery in a monastery. Plus it had Christian Slater, F. Murray Abraham, Ron Perlman, William Hickey, and a sex scene. The Boy Who Could Fly just had a mute kid and a bunch of teenagers processing trauma and grief. I may have been the target of one, but the other had nudity, so that's where my interests lay, so to speak. Actually, in retrospect, I may have seen the Connery flick The Dollar Show, but I unquestionably saw Crocodile Dundee there, so that's the story I'm sticking to. Positive sentiment toward Australia had been building for much of the decade, but Paul Hogan's Fish Out of the Outback story blew up Aussies around the world as a thing to be. It's the sort of project that was boffo in its time, largely forgotten since, but we've never stopped doing variations on "That's not a knife, this is a knife" bit.
Defenders of the earth. Out of the sky, his rockets ignite. Jets into battle, flying faster than light.
Flash Gordon.
Lion of the jungle, the hero who stalks. The beast call him brother, the ghost who walks.
Phantom. Defenders. Master of magic spells and illusion. Enemies crumble in fear and confusion. Mandrake.
Defenders of the earth.
His strength is a legend, his skills conquer all. Armed with his power, we will never fall. Lothar.
Defenders of the earth.
With our new young heroes proving their worth, fall become mate, defending the earth.
Defenders of the earth. Defenders of the earth.
Marauder Books quarter bin shoutouts of the month go to Imperial Comics Black Star #1, Now Comics Valor Thunderstar and his Fireflies #1, and Eclipse Comics Villains and Vigilantes #1. This is also where I'm buying the early issues of Star Brand, which I regretted missing, and Mark Hazard Merc #3, which I didn't. Peter David's script was so embarrassing that I'm rethinking my theory about him getting fired for being too real, and the fill-in art was tolerable. Between my Al Milgrom, Peter David, and Conway Buscema periods, I tend to center Spectacular Spider-Man in my webhead experience. I also dismiss any influence from Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz, who mostly worked on books that I skipped. And yet my half-brother bought Amazing Spider-Man #284, first part of the Gang War, and it certainly read through that story arc. This isn't my first or last foray into Amazing either. It's just that nothing ever hit me like the death of Jean DeWolf. As you may have surmised, this one is about a mob conflict with superhuman contributors, including Hobgoblin, Jack-O-Lantern, the Rose, Hammerhead, and the Arranger. While these characters had a strong period presence, they were largely abandoned going into the 90s, and this churn helped to distance me from the Spider titles. I experienced the classic rogues more through stuff like Marvel Saga and the cartoons, so they never resonate in the same way for me. Probably one of the reasons I've yet to embrace a Spider-Man movie is that they don't deal with my generation of supporting cast or foes, although Into the Multiverse came the closest with the Kingpin and Prowler. I can admit that earlier in the 80s, Chuck Norris was kind of my guy in the action hero contest. Stallone was too mumbly macho and sweaty for my liking. Schwarzenegger was coming up, but he was still more of a mute barbarian to me. The Bonds were dilettante Brits, not my people. Eddie Murphy was funnier than he was fighty. Rutger Hauer mostly played bad guys. I couldn't trust Harrison Ford to bring it when he wasn't playing Indiana Jones, because he was in too many dramas. I guess Kurt Russell was in some stuff, but I hadn't seen The Thing or Escape from New York yet, and they didn't bowl me over when I did. I really liked Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson, but they were more 70s guys in their 50s and 60s, good with a gun and a punch, but tapping out beyond that. So if I wanted a hero who could perform a proper roundhouse kick and look like he meant it, I defaulted to Jim Braddock. Norris had been in a steady stream of schlocky chop-socky with American action vibes for a decade, supplying material to UHF television. He seemed to peak mid-decade with the Missing in Action trilogy, Invasion USA, and the Delta Force with Lee Marvin. To me, Firewalker was the big stumbling point. His adventure comedy with Louis Gossett Jr. See, Chuck can glower and growl through a line delivery, but his screen presence is rivaled by the furniture in the room, so the laughs were too high a bar. He tried a little sci-fi and horror, but nobody wanted to write for this guy, and he eventually found his level on a long-running CBS procedural where the 50-something could cool it with the more advanced martial arts. All this is to say that the cartoon and toy line, Chuck Norris and the Karate Commandos, makes sense only when you realize that most of the 80s action stars you remember squeaked in a few years ahead of the 90s. So Chuck was briefly a genuine competitor against Rambo. One of his strengths, though, was an excessive violence, which even in the 80s wasn't going to fly in a cartoon. The Star Comics logo on the adaptation was something of the death knell on Norris's legitimacy. If that alone hadn't done it, late career Steve Ditko would have. Flipping the book, it's still surprisingly violent, with gangs going at each other with broken beer bottles and wooden planks that resemble Chuck's action chops. You can't take it seriously though. With the big grins and dumb kid and a sumo wrestler as the comic relief, the cartoon only ran for a week, and I can't tell you what the deal was. It was ninjas, but also terrorists, and the main bad guy was simply dubbed Super Ninja. I don't think I bought any of the action figures. After a few months, I'm back to Daredevil with number 238, and a near unrecognizable Art Adams on the cover, being mucked up by Klaus Janson inks. The interiors are by Sal Buscema and Steve Lee Aloha, which is also not a complimentary combination, especially on a loose Mutant Massacre tie-in spotlighting Sabretooth. Man, was there a concerted effort to put Sabretooth over 9 years into his career? And if so, was it all down to tying him into Wolverine's backstory? I don't recall ever seeing Sabretooth before 1986, and then he was everywhere. DC somehow pulled the same trick with Lobo a few years later. Anyway, this is an oddball story with a uniquely and questionably sympathetic take on the feral mass murderer, and it's only that much more off with a mismatched art team. Still, I picked it up at a flea market relatively soon after release, likely influenced by having read at least one of the better stories to follow starting next month. I wouldn't qualify myself as a Defenders of the Earth fan, and it was my half-brother who once again bought the first Star Comics issue, credited to Stan Lee and Alex Saviuk. It was as horror-y as you'd expect, and no others came home. And yet something about this property draws me to it. I owned 4 of the 6 action figures produced by Galoob, and that was on my own. I'd seen the 1980 Flash Gordon motion picture theatrically, and while there was no Star Wars, or even Buck Rogers, I was really impressed by its bold aesthetic. I also watched the CBS cartoon series that ran at the same time. While I like his various outfits, I'll always favor the sharp red number with the button strap collar exclusive to Defenders. Whenever a newspaper crossed my path, I headed for the funny pages, but made time for the serious adventure strips. They were terribly boring, but any glimpse of superheroes was a win, and the Phantom looked the part. I loved his costume, and the generational hero aspect was cool. I don't recall if Mandrake the Magician was still running in a Houston newspaper, but I had some awareness that he had decades of print history and directly inspired Doctor Strange. I had no clue that Lothar was a glorified henchman to Mandrake prior to Defenders of the Earth, but he had a swell-looking action ensemble. The Defenders were all leaner of frame than was typical for figures in the Motu size range, and they dressed in spiffy fashion, so they really classed up toys in those dimensions. They also had die-cast forearms with a tab on the back that you could use to make them swing punches, which could mindlessly pass a few minutes of time. The cartoon was made by Marvel Productions, so it had the appealing comic book look of G.I. Joe and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. They went hard on production for a single 65-episode season, so there was so much content that you would inevitably tune in, even if only after you'd exhausted less robust libraries like the likes of Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. The theme song was sweet, and the show handled an international squad of child understudies better than on Captain Planet and the Planeteers, which clearly owed it a debt. These were the original comic strip adventure heroes, and despite still being owned by King Features Syndicate, I can't help but root for the OGs. I got a kick out of the King Features section of Universal Studios Orlando. I got a good deal on a pair of Flash and Ming the Merciless mini busts, and I have the modern take on the Defenders Flash NECA put out a few years ago. I sporadically support their comics, like the 1995 Marvel Phantom miniseries by DeVries and Lumsden, or the King Watch material released by Dynamite Entertainment. I even got the cheap trade recently put out by Mad Cave collecting the 4 Star Comics issues, though their original content seems especially uninspired. I am on board for their new Flash Gordon series though, though, if only for the gorgeous Will Conrad art. Marie Severin finished Mark Texeira's breakdowns on Sci Force number 3, and you can't tell the text didn't do the job himself. It looks so good and true. This is the first breather issue of the series, mostly about the kids going to school, relating to one another, and failing to relate to their classmates. I genuinely like these kids, feeling and fearing for them when a knife-wielding punk tries to cut them out of his circles. New scripter Danny Fingeroth doesn't seem to miss a beat, as his teen drama works for me in a way New Mutants and the like never could. Strike Force Morituri was another fantastic read, as a government think tank that gave the team its powers is also willing to allow them to die in a potentially lethal stress test to force the swift manifestation of their broader abilities. That seems like a waste of resources to me, since each member already had enhanced physical attributes to survive the Morituri process. But these deadly games work because of the human drama of their very real peril. While Peter B. Gillis' script is remarkable in its own, much of the heft comes from the art of Brent Anderson at his career best, accomplished through no small help by the inks of Scott Williams. Each character has a distinctive face, body type, posture, manner of emoting. It's a beauty to behold. I've said before and shall repeat, this is one of the best comics from arguably the best year ever for mainstream production. After rereading the first issue, I was already kicking myself for missing the admittedly pricey trade paperbacks from a dozen years back, but there's blessedly a comprehensive single-volume omnibus coming next year. My brother had West Coast Avengers number 16, where Tiger and Hellcat teamed up against Tiger Shark and Whirlwind. I was more into the villains than the heroines at the time, but they did not acquit themselves well. Finally, appropriately, we'll wrap up with the Colossal X-Men Annual number 10, continuing to feature Arthur Adams' illustrations, with the absorption of his signature character Longshot and the Mojoverse into the mutant sphere. This was also the first appearance of the X-Babies. The actual X-Men temporarily regressed to young children, and the far less heralded up-aged New Mutants in fairly lackluster adult costumes. I don't think it helped the New Mutants' long-term prospects that they looked like dorks even under Adams' pen. And when you think about it, what have they amounted to? Magic's about the only member presented that still has something of a career, and she's not exactly a huge breakout in modern X circles. Anyway, this annual was a load of fun, and highly coveted at the time, especially for the peak body hair on Naked Logan, which I admit is a metric that opens up a line of questioning that I won't be fielding. I got the Marvel Arthur Adams Omnibus, so I'll probably reread this someday, but the number of words per panel is almost as dense as Wolverine's personal foliage, and somehow more off-putting. I usually work on resumes throughout the month, sometimes during light duty while on the job. That wasn't in the cards throughout August. So all this research and writing has been done in a crunch and with a 1-week deferral from its usual top of the month release slot. Forgive me if I barrel through the history section on Sunday night while still needing to read and review 4th week comics. It's pretty easy too, because most of what I remember was already covered elsewhere. There were an awful lot of bombings in various places this month, and I vaguely recall the hijacking of Pan Am Flight 73 that left 21 dead. Captain EO debuted at Disney theme parks, and I recall it getting coverage at places like Entertainment Tonight, but I've never been to Disneyland or seen what I understand was a stinker of a mini-movie. Apparently the TV show Airwolf moved from CBS to the basic cable channel USA, but I never had any interest beyond that sweet theme song. October is a 5 Wednesday month in 1986, and I'll try to make time to cover more stuff then. Particularly another look at books that I've been deferring for a while. Folks who wanted to see our resume include Alex O, who added, "This was around the time I went to the US from the Philippines. A lot of these comics really opened up my collecting once I was there. I remember reading Strike Force Morituri, my cousin introduced me to it, and being oblivious to the presence of Filipinos in comics. Yet Filipinos have made incredible contributions to comics, especially relative to their population. I'm a huge fan of the Filipino school of art. So my absolute favorites, Will Portacio, Rudy Nibres, Alfredo Alcala, Nick Manabat, just an incredible catalog of work. Moving on, Between the Pages blog, Billy Hines, Comics Enabler, who added, "If you ever want to talk G.I. Joe, I'm there. This episode managed to be super frustrating for wanting to join in." Yeah, it's funny, there's actually a lot of G.I. Joe podcasting out there. Nobody ever invites me to any of that stuff, probably because they know that I'm always going to be as critical as I am kind to any of that material. My understanding is that they're supposed to be doing a reprint edition of the battle stories. That's stuff that I've never been exposed to, and I'm very curious about. So if they put out that collection, if I have access to it, and if I get around to reading it, then that might be a good way of crossing the pond and getting your side of the Joe phenomenon, the Action Force phenomenon. But carrying on, Breakdown, Chris at Bad Books for Beginners, Chris Dunford, Dave's Comics Heroes blog, DC Dave, Derek WC, Ed Moore at Teal Productions, Geek to Me Radio, History of Comics on Film, I Was Joe Was, The Irredeemable Shag, JMT Productions, Julia Raoul, Keith G. Baker, Lamar the Revenger, Lucretia Garcia, Maxo, Milladream, Monarch DeFay, Petros Gaspard, Pine Time, who added, I enjoy the series a lot. It overlaps heavily with my own collection, and I feel like the cadence and amount of words you cram into every second is like doing those brain tests that keep you from developing memory loss. If I can process everything, it means my brain is still going strong. Yeah, I've always described my podcast speaking style as blipvert. Pop Culture Affidavit, who added, Order of Battle. My friends and I read the covers off of those. Richard Field, Superbound, Thirsties New and Used, Tim Price, and Twins Are Rising. The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spine's Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.
Searching my mind for some truths to reveal. What thoughts are fantasy? What memories?